For most of the 20th century, neuroscience operated under a belief that shaped medicine, psychology, education, and the way millions of people understood themselves and their capacity to change. The belief was this: the adult brain is fixed. By early adulthood, the structure of the brain, its connections, its circuits, its fundamental architecture, is essentially complete and essentially permanent. You could learn new information, of course. You could acquire new skills. But the deep patterns, the neural grooves cut by years of experience, habit, and emotional conditioning, those were written in something close to stone. The brain you had was, in any meaningful sense, the brain you were going to keep. This belief was not fringe. It was the consensus position of mainstream neuroscience for decades. And it filtered through into clinical practice, into educational philosophy, and into the stories people told about themselves. I have always been this way. This is just how I am. Some things cannot be changed. And then the research started coming. Study after study, from laboratories around the world, using technologies that had not existed before, functional MRI, positron emission tomography, advanced cellular imaging, began to show something that contradicted the fixed brain doctrine so completely and so consistently that the field had no choice but to revise one of its most foundational assumptions. The brain is not fixed. It is plastic. It is constantly, dynamically, structurally changing in response to experience, attention, learning, and practice, across the entire human lifespan, well into old age. The discovery has a name: neuroplasticity. And it is one of the most important scientific revolutions of the past 50 years, not just for neuroscience, but for everything we believe about healing, growth, and the possibility of becoming someone different from who we have been. A reference guide covering the key concepts and practical applications is linked in the description. Let's build the full picture. Section 1. What neuroplasticity actually is. Neuroplasticity, from the Greek neuron, meaning nerve, and the Latin plasticus, meaning moldable, refers to the brain's capacity to change its structure, its connections, and its functional organization in response to experience. It is not a single phenomenon. It is an umbrella term for a collection of related mechanisms through which the brain modifies itself, at the level of individual synapses, at the level of neural circuits, and at the level of large-scale brain regions and networks. The foundational insight is deceptively simple: the brain is an experience-dependent organ. It does not develop in isolation from the world it inhabits. It develops in response to that world, shaped by every significant experience, every repeated behavior, every sustained pattern of thought and emotion and attention. And this shaping is not merely functional, not merely the acquisition of memories and skills. It is structural. The physical architecture of the brain, the density of synaptic connections, the myelination of neural pathways, the relative size and activation patterns of different regions, is literally different in response to what a person has experienced, practiced, and attended to. The implications of this are staggering, and they are still being fully worked out. If the brain structure reflects its experience, then changing experience changes structure. Changing what we attend to, what we practice, how we think, what we do repeatedly, changes the physical brain. Not metaphorically. Not simply functionally. Structurally. The neurons make new connections. The connections that are used repeatedly become more efficient. The connections that are not used weaken and eventually prune away. The brain is literally sculpted by what we do with it. It is worth being precise here about what neuroplasticity does and does not mean. It does not mean that change is easy, unlimited, or instantaneous. The brain's plasticity operates according to specific mechanisms and specific conditions, and understanding those conditions is what makes the difference between vaguely knowing that change is possible and being able to deliberately and systematically pursue it. Neuroplasticity is not magic. It is biology. And like all biology, it has its logic, a logic that, once understood, becomes extraordinarily useful. Section 2. The science that changed everything. The story of how neuroplasticity was established is itself a story worth knowing, because it illustrates both the revolutionary nature of the discovery and the specific observations that forced neuroscience to revise its most fundamental assumptions. Donald Hebb, a Canadian neuropsychologist working in the 1940s, proposed what has become one of the most quoted principles in all of neuroscience: neurons that fire together, wire together. Hebb's postulate, as it became known, described the mechanism of synaptic strengthening, the observation that when two neurons consistently activate in proximity, the synapse connecting them is strengthened, making future co-activation more likely and more efficient. This was a theoretical proposal in 1949. It took decades of subsequent research to demonstrate its mechanisms at the cellular level. But it planted the conceptual seed from which the entire field of neuroplasticity would grow. Michael Merzenich's work in the 1980s provided some of the most compelling early evidence in living animals. Merzenich, working with cortical maps in primates, demonstrated that the brain's representation of the body, the somatosensory cortex's map of which neurons respond to stimulation of which body parts, was not fixed but dynamic. When a finger was amputated, the cortical territory that had represented that finger was taken over by adjacent representations. When specific fingers were used extensively in a trained task, their cortical representation expanded. The map changed in response to experience. This was, at the time, profoundly controversial. It is now foundational. Eleanor Maguire's landmark study of London taxi drivers, published in 2000, brought neuroplasticity into the popular imagination with unusual force. London taxi drivers are required to memorize the layout of 25,000 streets and thousands of points of interest, a process that takes years and is known as the knowledge. Maguire and her colleagues used MRI to compare the brains of experienced taxi drivers with control subjects and found that taxi drivers had significantly larger posterior hippocampi, the region of the brain critical for spatial navigation, and that the size of this enlargement correlated with years of experience as a driver. The brain had literally grown in the region that was most used. Experience had changed structure. And the work of researchers like Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin demonstrated that mental training, specifically meditation practice, produces measurable, structural changes in the brain, increased thickness in regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and self-awareness, altered activation patterns in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, changes in the brain's default mode network that correspond to reduced rumination and increased present moment awareness. The brain does not merely respond to physical experience. It responds to mental experience, to where we direct our attention, to the patterns of thought we practice, to the quality of our inner life. Section 3. How the brain actually rewires, the mechanisms. Understanding the specific mechanisms of neuroplasticity transforms it from an inspiring concept into a practical framework for deliberately pursuing change. There are several distinct mechanisms, operating at different scales, that collectively constitute what we mean when we say the brain rewires itself. Synaptic plasticity is the most fundamental level, the strengthening or weakening of individual synaptic connections between neurons. Long-term potentiation, or LTP, is the cellular mechanism of synaptic strengthening. When a synapse is repeatedly activated, molecular changes at the synapse make subsequent activation more efficient. The synapse becomes, in a very literal sense, better at transmitting the signal. This is the cellular substrate of learning, the physical change in neural tissue that underlies the acquisition of every skill, every habit, every piece of knowledge. And it is reversible. Synapses that are not used undergo long-term depression, limited, weakening and eventually pruning away in a process that is as important to brain efficiency as the strengthening of frequently used connections. Neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, was, until the 1990s, believed to be impossible in the adult brain. The brain you were born with, the consensus held, was the total neuronal supply you would ever have. Then Peter Eriksson and colleagues demonstrated in 1998 that new neurons are indeed generated in the adult human hippocampus, the region critical for memory and learning, throughout the lifespan. The rate of this neurogenesis is influenced by exercise, learning, stress levels, sleep quality, and numerous other factors. This discovery added a dimension to neuroplasticity that its earliest theorists had not imagined. Not only do existing connections change, but the very cellular material of the brain can be replenished and expanded. Myelination is a third mechanism that operates at a larger scale. Myelin, the fatty sheath that wraps around neural axons, increases the speed and efficiency of neural transmission dramatically, by a factor of up to 100. Pathways that are used repeatedly become more heavily myelinated over time, making their transmission faster and more reliable. This is part of why practiced skills feel automatic. The neural pathway is not just stronger, it is faster, more efficient, and requires less conscious effort to activate. And myelination, like synaptic strength, is experience-dependent, it follows use. And at the largest scale, neuroplasticity involves the reorganization of entire neural networks, the shifting of which regions are recruited for specific tasks, the development of new functional connections between distant brain areas, and the reallocation of cortical territory as the demands on the brain change. This large-scale reorganization is what is visible in the MRI studies, the expanded hippocampi of taxi drivers, the thickened prefrontal cortices of meditators, the altered amygdala responses of people who have undergone effective psychotherapy. The brain at the network level reflects, in its architecture, the life that has been lived inside it. Section 4. Neuroplasticity and mental health. The implications of neuroplasticity for mental health and psychological healing are among the most significant and most underappreciated dimensions of this entire field. And they are, for many people, particularly people who have been told or have told themselves that they are permanently defined by their diagnosis, their history, or their patterns, genuinely life-changing. Every effective psychological treatment works, at the neurological level, through neuroplasticity. This is not metaphorical. When cognitive behavioral therapy reduces anxiety and depression, what is happening in the brain is measurable and structural. Activation in the prefrontal cortex increases, activation in the amygdala decreases, connectivity between regions associated with cognitive control and emotional regulation improves. The therapy is changing the brain. Not just the thoughts. Not just the behavior. The neural architecture that generates both. Trauma provides one of the most compelling and most important illustrations of neuroplasticity's relevance to mental health, in both directions. Chronic trauma exposure produces measurable neurological changes, reduced hippocampal volume, hyperactivation of the amygdala, altered prefrontal cortex functioning, changes in the brain's stress response systems. These are not character flaws or permanent states. They are the brain's neuroplastic response to sustained threat, the organ doing exactly what it is designed to do, adapting its structure to the environment it is in. And effective trauma treatment produces measurable changes in exactly these same regions. Hippocampal volume can increase with treatment, amygdala hyperreactivity can decrease, prefrontal regulation can be restored. The damage is not permanent. The brain can heal. Because the brain is plastic. Depression, which involves characteristic patterns of reduced activity in prefrontal regions, altered connectivity in the default mode network, and dysregulation of the neurochemical systems that modulate mood, responds to treatment through neuroplastic change. Antidepressant medications work in part by promoting neurogenesis in the hippocampus. Psychotherapy produces overlapping but distinct neurological changes. Exercise, which is among the most powerful interventions for depression that exists, promotes neurogenesis, increases BDNF, the brain's primary growth factor, and produces structural changes in regions associated with mood regulation. The brain is not stuck in its depressed state. It is in a neuroplastic state that has adapted to conditions of sustained low mood, and it can adapt again, toward health, with the right conditions and the right interventions. For therapists, the neuroplasticity framework is one of the most powerful pieces of psychoeducation available, because it provides a scientific foundation for hope that does not require minimizing the client's current suffering or promising outcomes that cannot be guaranteed. What it can honestly say is this: the brain that produced these patterns can produce different ones. The structure that was built by experience can be rebuilt by different experience. Change is not just philosophically possible, it is neurologically obligatory, given the right conditions. Section 5. The conditions that maximize brain change. Neuroplasticity is not equally available under all conditions. The brain is more plastic in some states than others, and understanding what those states are is the difference between knowing that change is possible and being able to deliberately create the conditions for it. Attention is the most fundamental condition. The brain changes most in the direction of what is attended to. This is not merely motivational language, it is neurological mechanism. Attention determines which neural circuits are activated, and activation is what drives both LTP and the myelination that follows repeated use. Michael Merzenich's research demonstrated this with striking precision. Passive exposure to a stimulus produces minimal cortical change, while active, attentive engagement with the same stimulus produces substantial change. The brain is not a passive recording device. It is an attention-dependent one. Where you point your attention, the brain follows. Repetition is the second essential condition. Neuroplastic change is not produced by single exposures, it is produced by the repetition that drives synaptic strengthening, myelination, and the gradual automatization of new patterns. This is the neurological basis of the insight that behavior change requires practice rather than simply decision. The decision activates the circuit once, but the repetition is what changes its efficiency and its default activation threshold. The new neural pathway has to be walked enough times that it becomes the path of least resistance rather than an effortful alternative to the existing groove. Novelty and challenge sit in productive tension with repetition. The brain's plasticity is heightened in the presence of new, challenging experiences that require adaptation, because novelty activates the neuromodulatory systems, particularly dopamine and acetylcholine, that regulate synaptic plasticity. Learning is most powerful at the edge of current capacity, difficult enough to require genuine effort and generate prediction error, manageable enough that the learning system can successfully update. This is why environments that are both safe and challenging, like good therapeutic relationships, good educational contexts, and good physical training, are the environments that most consistently produce neuroplastic change. Sleep is non-negotiable. The brain consolidates the neuroplastic changes initiated during waking hours primarily during sleep, particularly during slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, when memory consolidation, synaptic pruning, and the integration of new learning into existing neural architecture occur. A day of excellent practice followed by poor sleep is a day of reduced neuroplastic gain. Sleep is not recovery from the work of change. It is where the work of change is completed. And stress level matters profoundly, in a specific and nuanced way. Moderate stress, the kind produced by manageable challenge, enhances neuroplasticity by activating the arousal systems that support focused learning. Chronic, uncontrollable stress is one of the most powerful inhibitors of neuroplasticity, through its effects on cortisol, hippocampal neurogenesis, and prefrontal cortex function. The therapeutic relationship, the sense of agency, and the management of overwhelming stress are not peripheral to the neuroplastic work of psychological healing. They are the conditions without which it cannot proceed. Section 6. Putting it into practice. The gap between understanding neuroplasticity and actually using it is the gap between information and practice, and it is a gap that is closed not by more information but by the specific, repeated, attentive engagement with new patterns that the neuroscience identifies as the driver of structural change. The most important practical implication of neuroplasticity is this: what you practice grows. Not what you intend. Not what you understand. What you actually do, repeatedly, with attention. The anxious thought pattern that is rehearsed daily becomes more efficient, more automatic, more rapidly activated, because the brain is doing exactly what it is designed to do, strengthening what is used. And the cognitive restructuring practice, the self-compassion practice, the mindfulness practice, these also become more efficient, more automatic, more accessible, for exactly the same reason. The brain does not distinguish between patterns worth strengthening and patterns worth weakening. It simply strengthens what is practiced. This has a direct implication that is both sobering and empowering. The first attempts at a new pattern will feel effortful, unnatural, and unconvincing, because the new neural pathway is thin and the old one is well worn. This is not evidence that the new pattern is wrong or that change is not happening. It is evidence that the neuroplastic work is in its early stages. The discomfort of the beginning is not a signal to stop. It is the signal that the brain is being asked to build something it has not yet built, and with repetition and attention, it will. For therapists, neuroplasticity provides the neurological rationale for everything from homework and between session practice to the importance of the therapeutic relationship as a corrective emotional experience. The client who practices the new cognitive pattern, the new behavioral response, the new way of relating to themselves between sessions is not doing extra credit. They are doing the work that changes the brain, because the in-session insight activates the circuit, but the repeated practice is what rewires it. The Neuroplasticity 101 resource in the description covers all of the key concepts, the mechanisms, the conditions, the mental health applications, and the practical implications, in one organized, accessible reference. It is designed to be a tool for understanding that you come back to, a foundation for the work of deliberate brain change that is available to every person who uses it. The Fixed Brain was a story. A story told in good faith, by serious scientists working with the tools they had, who drew the most reasonable conclusions available from the evidence in front of them. And it was wrong. Your brain is not fixed. It is not hardwired in the ways that matter most. The patterns that feel like who you are, the anxiety, the self-criticism, the relational habits, the ways of moving through the world that you have been moving through for so long they feel like bedrock, these are not bedrock. They are neural circuits. Built by experience, strengthened by repetition, and entirely capable of being changed by new experience and new repetition, under the right conditions, with the right support, across time. This is not a promise that change is easy. Neuroplasticity is not a shortcut. It is biology, which means it is subject to the same conditions and constraints as all biological processes. It requires attention, repetition, sleep, manageable challenge, and the nervous system regulation that makes learning possible. It takes longer than we want and it works less dramatically than we hope in the short term. But it works. The evidence is unambiguous. The brain changes. People change. Not always in the ways they planned, not always on the timeline they hoped, but genuinely, structurally, measurably. The Neuroplasticity 101 resource is in the description, the science, the mechanisms, and the practical applications in one place. Share this video with someone who has been told, or has told themselves, that they cannot change. The neuroscience has something important to say about that. And I will see you in the next one.